April 1943, Camp Hereford, Texas. A lone figure hunched over a crude wooden desk, the tip of his pencil trembling as though it carried the weight of his entire homeland. Serente Joseph Morelli, a Sicilian conscript who only months earlier had been battling in North Africa, pressed his face close to the paper. He wanted every word to reach his mother intact, though he knew it would take months, perhaps 8 or more, before it ever touched her hands. What he wrote was almost unthinkable. Mama, they feed us like we are guests, not prisoners. White bread every day, meat, vegetables, more food than we saw in 2 years of war. For an Italian soldier raised under Mussolini's banners, this was a confession as shocking as any battlefield surrender. Italy's propaganda had painted America as decadent, divided, weak. The United States, they were told, was a land of soft people, destined to crumble under the strain of the war. Yet here, from behind barbed wire, Morelli was witnessing the opposite. Through the barracks window, the Texas plains glowed with electric light, something many Italian villages had never possessed. American tractors plowed fields at night, a surreal image for men accustomed to farming by hand. Guards in khaki uniforms leaned against the wire, chatting casually and even sharing cigarettes with their Italian captives. The dissonance was enough to rattle a man's very sense of reality. Only weeks earlier, Morelli and thousands like him had been taught that surrender meant starvation or execution. In their darkest imaginings, captivity was supposed to be a slow death, not a revelation. Yet the moment they set foot on American soil, they had stepped into a paradox, a prison that felt freer in its abundance and order than the country they had been sent to die for. As the nights grew cooler in Texas, the men whispered their disbelief to one another. Morelli wrote that the Americans treat us not as enemies, but as workers resting from their labor. To soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to a fascist empire, this kindness was deeply confusing. The bread, soft and white, almost sweet compared to the coarse loaves of home, became a symbol of contradiction. It was not just food, it was proof that Mussolini's promises had been hollow. The Italians' minds reeled at every small detail. The electric lights seemed endless, as though the Americans had harnessed lightning itself. The water from the taps was clean, plentiful, and astonishingly hot. At night, music drifted across the plains from radios in the guards' quarters. Jazz, swing, and American ballads utterly foreign to men, raised on mandolins and folk songs. In moments like these, silence hung heavy among the prisoners, for they understood something dangerous, that the enemy was not weak at all, but impossibly strong, and perhaps even generous. The contrast was most evident in the Americans themselves. The guards were young, often no older than the Italians they watched, yet their uniforms were clean, their boots polished, their bodies well fed and strong. These were not the tired, starving troops Italian propaganda had promised would crumble at the first push. Here in captivity, Italians saw with their own eyes the face of a nation not collapsing, but thriving in war. Letters like Morelli S., when they finally slipped past censors and sailed across the Atlantic, shook Italian households to the core. For mothers and fathers, scraping to survive under Allied bombing raids, the idea that their sons ate meat and butter daily while captive seemed absurd. Some refused to believe it. Others clung to the letters as proof that, at least in America, their children were safe from the war's hunger. But behind every line of Morelli's letter was a private conflict. Gratitude sat uneasily beside shame. Gratitude for being alive, for bread and shelter. Shame for admitting that the enemy gave more dignity than their own leaders. This was the unspoken truth of April 1943, that Mussolini's soldiers were learning in the strangest classroom imaginable that the empire had failed them long before they failed it. And so, in the dusty barracks of Camp Hereford, among the flicker of electric bulbs and the steady hum of Texas wind, the transformation began. It did not start with speeches or indoctrination. It started with a meal, with warmth, with the simple shock of kindness. By the time Morelli's mother unfolded his letter in Sicily, that transformation was already underway. For him and for thousands of others, captivity was not an end. It was the beginning of a revelation that the world Mussolini had promised was a mirage, and that in the most unlikely of places, in the barbed wire shadows of Texas, they had stumbled upon something that looked dangerously close to paradise. By the summer of 1943, the shock of abundance had settled into routine. For men who once fought under the burning sun of Tunisia, life inside the Texas camps began to take on rhythms that felt less like imprisonment and more like exile in a strange, orderly village. At dawn, bugles no longer called them to bayonet drills, but to roll call. Breakfast followed: eggs, oatmeal, milk, sometimes even pancakes dripping with syrup. The Italians, bewildered, often joked that Mussolini should surrender just to taste the food. Then came the work. Across the endless plains, farmers were desperate for labor. America's young men were overseas, and hands were needed to keep wheat, cotton, and cattle moving. Under guard, Italians boarded trucks and were driven beyond the wire to pick cotton, dig irrigation ditches, mend fences. But the guards were often relaxed, sometimes leaving the men to work unsupervised. There were even stories, whispered with both pride and shame, that some Italians simply walked away for the afternoon, only to return at dusk because the camp offered better meals than freedom on the run. In the evenings, the barbed wire turned into something like the fence of a village square. Radios were permitted, books circulated in translation, and local teachers offered English lessons. Men who had only known illiteracy in Sicily or Calabria suddenly learned to sign their names in another language. A few even practiced writing poetry, inspired by the wide skies and the foreign stars above Texas. And then came the gardens. Italian prisoners, restless with time, began planting tomatoes, zucchini, peppers, and herbs in neat rows inside the compound. Soon, the camps smelled of basil and rosemary, scents that transported them back to their villages. From rough scraps of wood, they built ovens to bake crusty loaves, closer to the taste of home. When harvests came, guards and prisoners alike sampled the food. Some Texans even admitted, grudgingly, that the enemy's cooking was better than their own. This uneasy camaraderie grew slowly but surely. Farmers praised the Italians for their strength and skill, often saying they worked harder than the Mexican or German laborers nearby. In town, children would gather at the camp fence to trade fruit for hand-carved toys the Italians whittled from scraps. The barbed wire remained, but it seemed thinner with each passing week. Yet beneath this surface of calm, contradictions festered. For every prisoner who marveled at American generosity, another brooded over dishonor. "We are well-fed dogs," one wrote bitterly, ashamed that he enjoyed the enemy's bread, while his brothers starved in Naples. Some clung fiercely to Mussolini's words, insisting that these comforts were tricks meant to soften their resolve. Others quietly admitted that the Duce had lied. This divide was sharpest on Sundays, when chaplains held Mass in makeshift chapels. For some, the hymns became a refuge, a reminder of Italy's soul unbroken by war. For others, the silence during prayers was heavy with doubt, doubt about the regime, doubt about the meaning of their sacrifice, doubt about what it meant to be Italian at all. Letters home continued to weave this paradox. One man described Texas as a land of machines and bread without end. Another confessed that the Americans have treated us better than Mussolini ever did. Mothers read these words with tears, torn between relief and humiliation. Fathers warned their sons not to be deceived. Wives whispered the letters to neighbors in half belief, half resentment. And still, the seasons turned, the gardens ripened, the fields yielded cotton, and the Italians became part of the landscape. Barbed wire no longer felt like a cage. It felt like the boundary of a strange, temporary homeland. The irony was bitter. Only in captivity had they been allowed to live lives richer, freer, and more dignified than in the empire they once bled for. In this strange equilibrium, the seeds of change had been planted. What began as survival was slowly turning into transformation. Inside the barbed wire gardens, men who had marched as soldiers were beginning to think as something else entirely. Workers, students, even dreamers. For the first time, they glimpsed a different future, one not promised by fascism, but by the very land they had been taught to despise. By autumn of 1943, the camps were no longer just places of confinement. They had become arenas of silent war, fought not with rifles, but with words, loyalties, and fear. The surrender of Italy in September shook every barracks like a thunderclap. One morning, the prisoners awoke to whispers. Mussolini had been deposed. Soon after came the stunning news. Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies. For men who still wore the black insignia of fascism, the humiliation was unbearable. To them, the king and Marshal Badoglio were traitors, cowards who had stabbed their own nation in the back. They swore that Mussolini, rescued from captivity by German commandos, was still the rightful leader of Italy. In the corners of the camp, these men painted fasces and the Duce's initials on walls, rallying comrades to resist corruption by the Americans. They called themselves I fascisti irriducibili, the unyielding fascists. But not everyone agreed. For others, the armistice felt like a release, a chance to disown a regime that had lied, starved, and abandoned them. These men looked at their letters from home, accounts of hunger, bombings, and despair, and asked themselves what loyalty meant when the people they loved were dying. They saw in the Americans not enemies, but possible allies, even friends. They called themselves I moderati, the moderates. The rift grew wide and dangerous. At night, in the dim barracks, arguments erupted. One side shouted that Mussolini was the fatherland, that to betray him was to betray Italy itself. The other replied that Mussolini had already betrayed Italy, dragging her into a war she could never win. The quarrels often ended in fists, and sometimes worse. In one Texas camp, a young prisoner named Luigi refused to shout Viva il Duce when ordered by hardline comrades. Days later, his body was found hanging in the shower, an apparent suicide. But whispers spread that it was no suicide at all, that Luigi had been strangled by fellow Italians for daring to abandon fascism. Guards heard the rumors, but with hundreds of prisoners and only a handful of watchmen, the truth remained hidden. Fear spread through the barracks like smoke. The Americans noticed. Some prisoners were marked as cooperators, given better work and access to English classes. These men often received letters more quickly or were assigned to farms where conditions were lighter. The unyielding fascists spat at them, calling them traitors, warning that one day Mussolini's black shirts, or worse, the Germans, would return and punish them. To accept American kindness was, in their eyes, to sell one's soul. Even the gardens reflected the divide. Fascists scrawled symbols in the dirt rows, while moderates tried to erase them with new plantings. Radios became battlegrounds too. Fascists demanded opera or martial anthems, while moderates secretly tuned to American jazz, swing, or the BBC's Italian broadcasts, which spoke of liberation and democracy. The guards, though sympathetic, did little to interfere. To them, the conflict was a weapon in itself. Italians fighting Italians meant fewer problems for the Americans, and yet, some guards shook their heads in disbelief at the violence brewing behind the wire. They hate each other more than they hate us, one sergeant remarked. Still, small moments of defiance bloomed amid the tension. A few moderates began writing essays in English, describing their hopes for a post-war Italy. Some sketched American tractors and radios, marveling at technology they wished to see in their villages. One man, Giuseppe, carved a wooden plaque that read simply, La vera libertà non si trova nel duce, ma nel pane condiviso. True freedom is not found in the douche, but in bread shared. But to share such thoughts was to risk one's life. In the camp's shadow world, men vanished into silence, beaten or threatened into submission by their own countrymen. By winter, the barbed wire no longer marked just the boundary between prisoners and guards. It marked the fault line of Italy itself, torn between fascism and a new, uncertain future. Within those fences, the war was being fought all over again, not with bullets, but with conscience. By early 1944, the tension inside the Texas camps could no longer be ignored. The Americans had been watching closely. Reports piled up, prisoners beaten in their sleep, letters confiscated by fellow Italians, whispered trials held in shadowed corners of the barracks. It was clear now. Italy was not one nation in captivity, but two. The War Department made its move. A program was announced. Men willing to renounce Mussolini and cooperate with the Allies would be separated into Italian service units, ISUs. They would trade barbed wire for barracks near U.S. bases, working as cooks, mechanics, and laborers. They would wear uniforms marked Italia instead of prison rags. They would be paid. They would be free, at least in practice. For many prisoners, it was an impossible temptation. Imagine freedom of movement, better food, the chance to send money home. To some, it was salvation. To others, it was treason. The division tore through the camps like wildfire. Moderates lined up eagerly, ready to sign declarations of loyalty to the new Italian government under Badoglio. They told themselves, and their comrades, that this was not betrayal, but duty. Italy has already changed sides, one explained. To serve the Allies now is to serve Italy herself. But the unyielding fascists answered with fury. They called the cooperators venduti, sellouts, They painted swastikas on walls and scrawled slogans praising Mussolini's new puppet state in Salo. They swore that one day, when Germany triumphed, those who had bent to America would hang. Violence followed swiftly. One night in Camp Hereford, a moderate named Francesco was dragged from his bunk. The next morning, he was found bruised and bloodied, his jaw shattered. He had tried to join the ISU. The message was clear. The Deuce's reach extended even here. Across oceans and barbed wire, the Americans, realizing the danger, began separating the two factions. The most fanatical fascists were herded into isolated compounds, nicknamed the Black Camps. Inside, discipline was brutal. Salutes were mandatory. Dissent was punished. Mussolini's portrait hung in makeshift chapels as if the war had never ended. Meanwhile, those who joined the ISUs experienced a strange new life, wearing armbands marked with green, white, and red. They worked alongside American soldiers in kitchens, depots, and workshops. They learned English faster, earned wages, and sometimes even received passes to visit nearby towns. Some married American women, beginning lives that would have been unthinkable in Sicily or Calabria. And yet, guilt gnawed at them. To work for the Americans was to carry a brand. Letters home were carefully worded, avoiding the admission that they had switched sides. Some mothers wrote back, proud that their sons were safe. Others replied with silence, their shame heavy between the lines. The camps became mirrors of Italy itself, divided, suspicious, uncertain of the future. In the black camps, hardliners dreamed of Mussolini's return and Hitler's victory. In the ISUs, moderates dreamed of a democratic Italy, rebuilt with American help. But beneath it all, one truth was inescapable. Captivity had ceased to be merely about survival. It had become a crucible in which thousands of Italians were forced to decide not just who they were in war, but who they would be in peace. For every man who raised his hand in salute to Mussolini, another now bent his head to learn a new word in English. The war inside the camps had chosen no victors yet, but it had begun to shape the future of Italy, one prisoner at a time, while thousands of men shed their prison rags for the armbands of the Italian service units. Another world festered behind barbed wire, one far darker. These were the black camps, the compounds reserved for those who refused to bend. Here, Mussolini was still Il Duce, Germany was still invincible, and every sunrise was greeted not with gratitude, but with clenched fists raised in the fascist salute. The Americans had placed the hardliners together to keep order, but in doing so, they had created something like a miniature dictatorship on Texan soil. The prisoners elected their own leaders, self-styled capos, who enforced discipline with threats and fists. They organized daily drills, marching in ragged lines across the dust, as if the Texas plains were the parade grounds of Rome. At night, they sang fascist hymns, their voices echoing across the wire like defiance against the foreign stars. Inside the black camps, fear was constant. Any hint of moderation, any whispered doubt, was dangerous. Prisoners were watched as closely by their countrymen as by the guards. Suspected sympathizers were beaten in the showers, their ribs cracked, their faces smashed against concrete. A few vanished altogether. Suicides that no one believed. The guards suspected murder, but with hundreds of Italians and only a handful of soldiers, the truth dissolved into silence. The propaganda was relentless. Mussolini's image was painted on walls. his words copied into notebooks and recited like scripture. Some carved fascist symbols into wood and wore them like talismans. In the mess hall, the capos thundered that Italy's surrender was a trick, that soon the Germans would sweep across Europe and restore the Dukes to power. They swore that America's kindness was poison, meant to turn proud soldiers into slaves. Yet cracks appeared even here. Hunger for truth gnawed at some men. They longed to read foreign newspapers, to know what had become of their families. They wondered, quietly, why the Americans did not starve or beat them if they were truly monsters. But silence was survival. To question openly was to invite a beating, or worse. So they marched, saluted, and shouted, Viva il Duce, even as doubt flickered in their eyes. The guards observed this strange theater with unease. They're prisoners of themselves, more than of us, one corporal muttered, and it was true. The black camps were cages inside cages, where fascism clung like a disease refusing to die. Occasionally, the two worlds collided. Moderates from the Italian service units, returning to visit friends, would slip notes through the wire describing their new freedoms: food, pay, the chance to see American towns. The hardliners spat at them, calling them traditori, traitors who had sold Italy for a plate of meat and a handful of dollars. Sometimes stones were thrown, sometimes fists. But behind the anger was fear. Deep down, the hardliners suspected what they dared not admit: that the war was lost, that Mussolini was finished, and that their fanaticism had become a hollow prison of its own making. In those black camps, the tragedy of Italy played out in miniature. A nation trapped between pride and ruin, loyalty and survival, past and future. For the unyielding fascists, the barbed wire was not America's cage. It was their own, built from memories, lies, and a faith that had already crumbled far across the ocean. The violence that had long simmered in whispers finally erupted in blood. By the spring of 1944, the divide between fascist hardliners and moderates was no longer just words, nor even bruises hidden beneath shirts. It became murder. At Camp A in Texas, the victim was a 32-year-old soldier named Filippo Santini. He had been quiet, bookish, and cautious, but when the War Department announced the Italian service units, Filippo stepped forward. He had grown tired of shouting slogans he no longer believed. He wanted to learn English, to earn wages, to prepare for life after the war. To the fascist leaders in the black camp, that choice marked him for death. On a warm April night, Filippo was cornered in the shower block. 3 men waited in the steam, their shadows long against the tiled walls. When guards found him the next morning, his body dangled from a knotted bedsheet, staged to look like suicide. But the bruises on his throat, the shattered cartilage in his neck, told another story. The Americans were shaken. They had expected discipline issues, fistfights, even escapes, but cold-blooded assassination inside a camp, that revealed something far more dangerous. Mussolini's ghost still commanded an army, even from across an ocean. The army launched an inquiry. Interrogations followed. Guards stormed through bunks, searching for hidden symbols and coded notebooks. A few suspects were isolated, but witnesses remained silent. Fear kept lips sealed. Every prisoner knew that the fascists' justice was swifter and more certain than the Americans. Word of Santini's death spread quickly through the camps. Moderates shivered, suddenly aware that their new path came with mortal risk. Some tore up their applications for the Italian service units. Others pressed forward, defiantly signing their names, vowing that fascism could not silence them. The divide grew sharper, each side now bound not only by ideology, but by blood. In Rome, similar scenes were unfolding in the streets. Partisans and fascists clashing, brothers fighting brothers, neighbors turning on neighbors. The camps in Texas had become a mirror of Italy itself. The Americans tried to contain the fire. Moderates were moved swiftly into ISUs, away from the shadow of violence. Hardliners were confined more tightly, their barracks treated as powder kegs ready to explode. Yet even under stricter watch, the fascists marched, saluted, and whispered threats. One guard wrote in his diary, "They kill each other in the name of a leader who cannot save them. It is as though they have carried Mussolini into the camp with them, and he watches through their eyes." Filippo Santini was buried in a small military cemetery, his grave marked by a plain wooden cross. For many, he became a symbol, not of betrayal, as the fascists sneered, but of courage. He had dared to choose a different Italy, and he had paid the price. The barbed wire was no longer just a boundary between America and its captives. It had become a frontier where two Italias clashed, one clinging to a dead empire, the other struggling, painfully, toward rebirth. And in that frontier, every prisoner was forced to decide which Italy he belonged to before his comrades decided for him. While fear darkened the black camps, another world was quietly unfolding in the Italian service units. Here, the prisoners turned workers wore neat khaki uniforms stitched with a small patch. Italia. No rifles were issued, but their hands were full. Tools, wrenches, pots, pens. They were no longer enemy aliens, but auxiliaries of the U.S. Army. And that small change carried the weight of redemption. The transition was startling. Men who had once been marched to fields under guard now rode trucks to army depots, air bases, and kitchens. Some unloaded cargo at ports, stacking crates of food and ammunition for soldiers bound overseas. Others cooked meals in military kitchens, serving American troops who eyed them with suspicion at first. Then, gradually, with nods of recognition. For many Italians, this work was the first taste of dignity since capture. They received modest pay, just a few dollars a month, but enough to send money orders home to starving families. They ate alongside Americans, sometimes even sharing coffee and cigarettes. English words crept into their vocabulary. "Okay, buddy. Ciao, hurry up." At night, they scribbled phrases into notebooks, trying to master the strange rhythm of a new tongue. A few were stationed near towns, and that changed everything. In Louisiana and Texas, Italian service unit members mingled with locals under the watch of lenient guards. Farmers welcomed them back to help with harvests. Shopkeepers traded with them freely. Town children stared at their accents and gestures, then laughed when they realized these prisoners were not so different after all. And then came something Mussolini never could have imagined: friendship, even love. A handful of Italians assigned to work near American families were invited into homes for meals. They tasted apple pie, played with children, listened to jazz on living room radios. In rare cases, romance blossomed. A young man from Naples, fluent now in broken English, courted a farmer's daughter with carved trinkets and clumsy serenades. Others found themselves writing letters to American women, their words clumsy but sincere. The service units became laboratories of transformation. In barracks, once filled with propaganda, men now pinned photographs of Hollywood stars, clipped cartoons from Life magazine, and dreamed aloud of a different Italy, an Italy of electricity, tractors, and bread without ration cards. Still, shadows lingered. Every man in the ISU knew that just miles away, behind heavier wire, his former comrades seethed in the black camps. Some worried about vengeance if they ever returned home. Letters from Italy warned of partisan killings, fascist reprisals, German roundups. Do not tell anyone here what you are doing, one mother begged her son. They will call you traitor. Yet for all the fear, life in the ISUs carried a quiet momentum. Each day of work, each word of English learned, pulled the men further from the old world. They began to see themselves not as Mussolini's soldiers, nor even as prisoners, but as men suspended between two identities. No longer fascist, not yet free, but already imagining a future in which barbed wire was only a memory. The irony was clear. In trying to divide and control them, the Americans had done something else entirely. They had given thousands of Italians their first glimpse of democracy, not through lectures or speeches, but through work, wages, and the simple dignity of choice. And as the war raged on across Europe, inside these quiet service units of America's South, the seeds of a new Italy were quietly taking root. By early 1944, the world inside the barbed wire fences no longer felt so distant from the war raging across the Atlantic. News trickled into the Italian service units in fragments, whispered rumors carried by American guards, scraps of newspapers smuggled in, a headline glimpsed on a train platform. For the men who had once marched under Mussolini's banners, these rumors were like drops of water in a desert. The Allies had landed in Italy, Rome was threatened, and whispers spoke of liberation. When word came of the June 1944 invasion of Normandy, the camps erupted in noise. In barracks, lit by bare bulbs, Italians cheered and sang songs they hadn't dared to raise in years. They celebrated the very armies they had once fought, understanding now that each step forward in France meant one step closer to freeing their homeland from German occupation. Some wrote letters home, laced with cautious hope. Mama, perhaps soon the war will end. Perhaps soon we will be together again. But joy mixed with anguish. Reports of bombings in Naples, Milan, and Florence reached the camps. Men read of hunger stalking their families, of villages burned in German reprisals. Prisoners wept silently in their bunks, clutching rosaries or small keepsakes. The abundance around them, the bread, the milk, the radios playing jazz, felt almost unbearable when measured against their family's starvation across the ocean. One prisoner confessed in his diary, "Here they give us so much food, I cannot finish it. There, my children search in garbage for scraps." Despite the ache of guilt, the service units poured themselves into their work with renewed intensity. At the Brooklyn Army Terminal, Italian laborers stacked ammunition crates with hands that trembled not from fatigue, but from pride. They painted messages on boxes for Rome, for Naples, for freedom. In California's endless fields, others bent over crops under the hot sun, knowing that the wheat and grapes they harvested would help feed both America's armies and Europe's hungry mouths. Everywhere they looked, they were confronted with contrasts. On the vast farms of the Midwest, Italians saw machines that harvested in hours what would take villages weeks in Italy. They marveled at silos taller than church bell towers and fields stretching further than their eyes could follow. One Sicilian farmer whispered to another, "This is not farming, this is magic." For the first time, they realized the scale of what modern agriculture could mean for a starving nation. Evenings brought quieter revelations. In some camps, chaplains organized masses where Americans and Italians prayed together. Hymns echoed in two languages, reminding the prisoners that faith, at least, was a bridge no ideology could sever. Local churches sent Christmas packages filled with candy, cigarettes, and soap, luxuries even Americans rationed carefully. On Christmas Eve, Italian voices carried across the Texas plains, singing carols in their mother tongue. Guards stood quietly, listening. Some moved to tears. Perhaps the most startling transformation was in the prisoners' minds. Education programs spread through the camps, English lessons, courses in mechanics, even correspondence classes from American universities. Men who had never finished school found themselves studying algebra, American history, or electrical engineering. At night, barracks flickered with lamplight as soldiers turned students bent over books. To many, it felt like a second chance at life. And through it all, the idea grew. Italy could be different. Not Mussolini's false empire, not a nation chained to hunger and propaganda, but something else, something closer to what they glimpsed in these American towns, where factory workers drove their own cars, where farmers had radios in their kitchens, where freedom and prosperity seemed possible without conquest. Still, the path ahead was uncertain. They were prisoners after all, their futures held by nations still at war. Yet in their hearts, a quiet conviction took root. The war had stolen their youth, but perhaps captivity had given them something in return, the belief that another Italy was waiting to be born. By 1944, the fences no longer felt like walls. For many Italians in the service units, the line between prisoner and neighbor had begun to blur. Work outside the camps exposed them to America not as an enemy to fight, but as a place of faces, families, and kindness. In small southern towns, Italian laborers became familiar figures in the rhythm of daily life. Farmers invited them to Sunday dinners after church, setting long tables where spaghetti met fried chicken, where red wine clashed with sweet iced tea. Children gathered around the men, laughing at their accents, teaching them words like y'all and howdy. To the locals, these Italians no longer seemed like Mussolini's soldiers. They were just young men, far from home, missing their mothers. Love, too, found its way through the barbed wire. In Louisiana, one prisoner named Enzo, once a bricklayer from Bari, was assigned to repair barns on a family farm. Over weeks of work, he fell into easy conversation with the farmer's daughter, Anna. Their words were a patchwork of broken English and shy smiles, traded between hammer blows and laughter. Soon, Enzo carved her small gifts from wood scraps, a bird, a cross, a tiny heart. Rumors of romance spread quickly among the prisoners, who teased him mercilessly, but many secretly envied his courage. Stories like Enzo's were rare, but not unheard of. Some ended in heartbreak. War regulations and family disapproval often tore couples apart, yet even fleeting romance left a mark, planting in the Italians a sense of belonging in a land that had once been their enemy. Friendship, however, proved more enduring. American guards initially wary, grew close to the men they oversaw. They played cards together, swapped cigarettes, and, when rules allowed, joined soccer matches where Italian shouts of Forza rang out across dusty fields. A guard in Texas later recalled, "They played like the war didn't exist. For 90 minutes, it was just men chasing a ball." Religion offered another bridge. Many Italians were Catholic, and when local congregations opened their churches, the men joined Americans in prayer. Holidays became shared celebrations. On Christmas Eve, townsfolk brought cakes and gifts. In return, the Italians performed carols, their voices carrying the ache of distance and the warmth of gratitude. For a moment, the camp gates seemed to vanish. There were quieter gestures too. Families adopted prisoners, bringing them into their homes on Sundays, writing letters to their relatives in Italy, sending care packages overseas. Some children grew up remembering their Italian, a young man who had taught them songs, built them toys, or shown them how to roll pasta by hand. Yet bonds carried risks. Letters from home reminded the prisoners that Italy remained divided and dangerous. Some families warned, "Do not tell anyone what you are doing. They will call you traitor." To fall in love with an American girl, to speak warmly of American kindness, was to invite suspicion back home. Still, these connections mattered. They reminded the Italians of their own humanity and offered a glimpse of what peace could look like. The war had begun with propaganda that painted Americans as monsters. Now, behind barbed wire, men discovered something far more powerful: the possibility of friendship with yesterday's enemy. In this unlikely setting, fields, farms, barracks, and borrowed kitchens, the seeds of reconciliation were quietly sown. The barbed wire still stood, but through it passed laughter, prayer, music, and love. And for many Italians, those bonds would linger long after the gates finally opened. Even in captivity, men carried within them an instinct no barbed wire could restrain: the urge to create. In the Italian prisoner of war camps, art, music, and craftsmanship flourished like hidden gardens, reminders that life was more than uniforms, drills, and rations. Barracks became workshops. From scraps of wood, tin, and cloth, the prisoners shaped wonders. Skilled carpenters built furniture for camp chapels and offices. Tailors stitched uniforms, but also found ways to craft puppets for evening shows. Stonecutters carved delicate rosaries from pebbles gathered in the yards. One man, once a sculptor in Florence, molded clay into busts of saints, which soon adorned the makeshift chapels inside the wire. Walls, too, became canvases. In several camps, prisoners painted vast murals, vivid landscapes of Tuscan hills, fishing boats rocking on Sicilian seas, or saints in heavenly light. In Texas, a camp chapel was transformed into something more like a Renaissance sanctuary, its walls covered in frescoes of angels and the Madonna. Guards entered and stood silently, astonished that such beauty could bloom in a place meant for confinement. Music flowed even more freely. Violins and guitars were begged, borrowed, or built from scrap. Accordions arrived in Red Cross parcels. Soon, each camp had its own orchestra or dance band, playing not only Italian folk songs, but American jazz they had learned by ear. On Saturday evenings, prisoners staged concerts. Guards, townsfolk, even farm families from miles away sometimes gathered outside the wire to listen as Italian tenors filled the night with arias by Verdi or popular ballads of longing. Theater, too, became a lifeline. Prisoners wrote plays, some comic, some tragic, performed on stages they built themselves. Costumes came from scavenged cloth and ingenious tailoring. Laughter roared through the camps as men lampooned Mussolini in satirical skits, a daring rebellion unthinkable only a few years before. For an hour or two, the prisoners were not captives, but actors, artists, free men on a stage. Education carried the same spirit of renewal. Camp libraries swelled with books sent by American universities and local churches. Men learned English, mathematics, even engineering through correspondence courses. Some kept notebooks so carefully that after the war, they would use them to find work or return to school in Italy. I came to America a soldier, one man later recalled. I left it a student. These acts of creation were not just diversions, they were survival. In every brushstroke, in every note of music, in every carved crucifix, lay a refusal to surrender to despair. Creativity gave shape to hope, and hope gave meaning to captivity. Yet there was irony too. Guards and locals often marveled at the beauty Italians produced inside their camps, beauty that seemed to embody a culture richer and deeper than the fascist caricature that had once been feared. The same men who had been seen as enemies now appeared as artisans, musicians, poets, ambassadors of another Italy, one older than Mussolini, one that might outlive him. Behind the wire, the Italians painted their homeland as they dreamed it, not a land of dictators and hunger, but a place of song, faith, laughter, and artistry. In doing so, they began to reshape not only how Americans saw them, but how they saw themselves. For all the music, art, and friendships blossoming behind the wire, a darker undercurrent still flowed through the Italian camps in America. Not every man accepted the path of cooperation. For some, loyalty to Mussolini, or at least to the idea of honor in defeat, burned as fiercely as ever. In the early years, the War Department had tried to separate the cooperators from the diehards. Yet, even after the creation of the black camps for hardened fascists, tensions remained. The divisions were not always clean. Some men declared loyalty to Mussolini out of fear. Others quietly despised him, but kept silent to avoid trouble. Many lived in the gray zone, caught between the promise of a new Italy and the shame of betraying the old one. Whispers traveled quickly through the barracks. Collaborators who joined the Italian service units were branded traditori, traitors. At night, their bunks might be smeared with insults, their belongings stolen or destroyed. In some camps, fists flew, and guards had to intervene. A few men, too afraid of reprisals, asked to be transferred out of mixed units and back into stricter camps where their former comrades would not reach them. Even small choices carried weight. Accepting American cigarettes, laughing with a guard, studying English. Each act could mark a man as soft in the eyes of the diehards. The pressure was heaviest on the young, who feared being remembered back home, not as survivors, but as cowards who bent to the enemy's will. Yet the reality of war was shifting. Letters from Italy told of Mussolini's fall, of Germans occupying Rome, of partisans rising in the mountains. The image of the Duce, once untouchable, now seemed brittle, even absurd. Some prisoners who had shouted fascist slogans in 1941 now whispered that Mussolini had led Italy only to ruin. This collapse of certainty left the camps tense and uneasy. In some, Propaganda leaflets still circulated, passed hand to hand, proclaiming that Germany would strike back, that Italy's honor demanded sacrifice. But fewer and fewer believed them. Men who once parroted slogans began to fall silent when the old songs were sung. The Americans watched closely, fearing sabotage, but what they saw was something stranger, the unraveling of an identity. Mussolini had promised these men glory. Now they were left with hunger, defeat, and barbed wire. Some clung to him because to let go would mean admitting their youth had been wasted. Others let go because they longed to believe the years ahead might still matter. The division was never absolute. Families, friendships, and faith blurred the lines, but the scars ran deep. Even decades later, veterans of those camps would speak of the bitterness between the black camp men and the servicemen, as though two Italies had existed within the same fences. It was, in many ways, a mirror of the country itself, torn between past and future, pride and shame, fear and hope. The camps became a rehearsal for Italy's own reckoning, a foretaste of the civil war that already burned across their homeland. And as 1945 drew near, with Germany staggering toward collapse, the question for every prisoner became unavoidable. When the gates finally opened, which Italy would they return to? And which Italy would they choose to build? Spring 1945 arrived like a storm breaking after years of heavy skies. News of Germany's collapse traveled faster than any guard could contain. It passed through whispers at the work sites, headlines glimpsed in American papers, hurried announcements from chaplains who sensed history shifting beneath their feet. When word of Mussolini's death reached the camps, silence fell first. The dukes, whose image had once loomed over parades and whose voice had thundered from radios, was now a corpse hanging upside down in Milan. For many prisoners, it was too much to absorb. Some stared at the dirt floor of the barracks, unsure whether to grieve, rage, or laugh. A few diehards wept openly, clinging to a faith that had crumbled overnight. Others, weary of the years lost, muttered that it was the end Italy had needed all along. Then came the bigger news. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. That night, the camps erupted in a noise not heard since capture. Songs rose from barracks, drums improvised from tin cans, shouts of Viva l'Italia echoing against fences. Guards, startled at first, let the celebrations continue. In some places, they joined in, sharing cigarettes, coffee, even bottles of beer. For once, the wire felt irrelevant. Prisoners and guards alike stood on the same ground, relieved, exhausted, alive. Yet beneath the joy lay unease. Freedom was no longer a dream, but an approaching reality, and with it came questions that gnawed at every man. What would they find when they stepped off the ships in Naples or Genoa? Families scattered, homes destroyed, villages burned by Germans or bombed by Allies. Some men feared returning at all, dreading the judgment of neighbors who might call them traitors, collaborators, or cowards. The Americans offered little clarity. Repatriation, they said, would take time. Ships had to be found, routes cleared, priorities sorted. Meanwhile, prisoners were free to continue their work in the service units, but the mood had shifted. Men who once sang while loading trucks now moved quietly, anxious to leave. "We are finished here," one prisoner wrote in his diary. But home? What is home now? There were small mercies. Before departure, many communities that had grown close to their Italians organized farewells. In Texas, families hosted dinners where prisoners sat at tables as honored guests rather than laborers. Children cried, clutching the hands of men they had come to see as uncles. In Louisiana, a farmer's daughter pressed a folded letter into a young man's hand, a promise to ride across the ocean. In New Jersey, guards shook hands with the very men they had once marched at gunpoint. For some prisoners, these gestures cut deeper than the news of victory. They had arrived in America as enemies. They would leave as something more complex: workers, friends, perhaps even family. The fences would open, but part of their hearts would remain behind in the fields, kitchens, and chapels where they had rediscovered their humanity. The war was over. The waiting was almost done. But the hardest journey was yet to come. The voyage not across the Atlantic, but back into a country they no longer recognized, and a future they had to build from ruins. The ships that carried the Italian prisoners back across the Atlantic were crowded with silence. Men leaned against railings, staring at the ocean, each lost in thoughts of what awaited them. For years they had dreamed of this voyage: home, family, freedom. Yet as the horizon of Italy drew nearer, anticipation curdled into dread. When the transports docked in Naples, the men rushed ashore, only to be struck dumb. Their city, once noisy with trams, vendors, and church bells, was a skeleton. Streets gaped with bomb craters. Buildings stood roofless, their windows like broken teeth. Children in rags swarmed the docks, begging for food, with hands outstretched, their eyes wide and hollow. For the returning prisoners, the sight was worse than captivity. In America, they had been confined, but they had never known this hunger. Families arrived in fragments. Mothers wept at the sight of sons they had thought dead. Wives clutched children too young to recognize their fathers. Brothers embraced, only to realize that half the family was missing, killed by bombings, shot by Germans, vanished in partisan fighting. One man, stepping into his ruined village, was greeted not with joy, but with suspicion. Where were you while we suffered? Eating well in America. The shame cut deep. Those who had served in the Italian service units faced the harshest words. Neighbors called them collaborators. Some partisans spat at their feet. A few were barred from local veterans associations, as though their years behind barbed wire had been a betrayal rather than a wound. We fought with hunger, one villager said bitterly. You fought with spoons. Yet others saw them differently. The returnees brought with them strange habits, an insistence on clean clothes, new words of English, stories of machines that harvested wheat in hours, of towns where workers owned radios and cars. They spoke of an Italy that could be rebuilt not through slogans, but through schools, electricity, and honest work. In America, one man told his neighbors, a farmer's child studies like a doctor's child. Why not here? Some carried more than ideas. They brought back notebooks filled with English lessons, carpentry skills learned on army bases, or dreams of starting businesses modeled on what they had seen. A few even carried photographs of American families who had hosted them for meals, reminders that yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's friends. Still, the return was never simple. Italy in 1945 was a nation split in two: monarchists versus republicans, Catholics versus communists, old fascists hiding in shadows. partisans demanding justice for the former prisoners. Every conversation seemed dangerous. To admit sympathy for America risked being branded a traitor. To denounce fascism too loudly could invite revenge from those still clinging to it. But within the private walls of homes, with families gathered around dim oil lamps, the returnees began to tell their stories of murals painted in chapels, of jazz played under Texas skies of kindness from strangers who had once been enemies. They spoke not of glory or conquest, but of dignity rediscovered in unlikely places. For many Italians, these stories were the first glimpse of another possibility, that their nation, though broken, could rise again, not through dictatorship, but through democracy, work, and hope. The homecoming was bitter, yes, but among the ruins, the seeds planted behind American barbed wire began to stir. Italy, in the late 1940s, was a land of rubble and arguments. Streets still bore the wounds of bombings, but the greater wreckage lay in its people, half starving, half furious, divided between vengeance and rebuilding. For the men returning from American camps, rejoining this fractured nation was like stepping into a storm. At first, many kept silent. Their memories of America felt out of place in villages where hunger still gnawed. If they mentioned the meals they had eaten in Texas or the music they had played in Louisiana, neighbors muttered darkly, "While we bled, you dined." Some men hid their khaki Italia patches, ashamed to admit they had served in the Italian service units. In certain towns, former partisans accused them of treachery. To have worn an American uniform, even without a rifle, was seen as a betrayal of suffering. Yet silence could not last. Over time, fragments of their experience slipped into daily life. A farmer who had picked cotton in Arkansas built irrigation ditches on his own land, recalling American methods. A mechanic who had serviced Jeeps in New Jersey opened a small garage, introducing neighbors to tools they had never seen. A prisoner who had learned English through camp lessons became a teacher, inspiring children with stories of faraway places. The veteran's knowledge spread quietly, like seeds scattered on rocky soil. Not all took root, but some flourished. Cooperatives emerged in the countryside, echoing the teamwork the men had practiced in service units. Ideas of fairness, efficiency, and democracy, once abstract, were grounded in lived experience. "We saw how it could work," one returnee explained. "Not theory, life." Still, wounds remained. Old fascists lurked in corners, whispering of honor lost. Communists, rising with force, denounced the Americans as new oppressors. In taverns and piazzas, arguments flared over what Italy should become: a republic, a socialist state, a kingdom reborn. For the ex-prisoners, every choice carried risk. To speak warmly of America was to invite suspicion. To hide their gratitude was to betray the truth of what they had lived. Family offered refuge. Around kitchen tables, by firelight, men told their children stories of murals painted in camp chapels, of guards who shared cigarettes, of Christmas carols sung across barbed wire. They spoke of discovering not only another country, but another Italy within themselves, an Italy that laughed, created, and worked without fear. In these quiet retellings, a transformation began. The children who listened grew up to inherit a new nation, one built not from Mussolini's broken promises, but from the lessons of resilience, cooperation, and imagination. The scars of captivity never vanished. Some men carried shame all their lives, refusing to speak of the years in America. Others clung to bitterness, feeling cheated of youth. But many looked back with a strange gratitude. Captivity had stripped them of weapons and pride, yet in its place had offered something unexpected: the tools to dream of a different Italy. And in the decades to come, as the country rose from ruins into a democracy of factories, universities, and bustling cities, the quiet influence of those years behind American barbed wire could still be felt in the way fields were plowed, in the songs remembered, in the stubborn belief that even out of defeat, renewal was possible. Decades slipped away. Italy was no longer the broken land the prisoners had returned to, but a republic pulsing with industry, art, and commerce. Skyscrapers rose in Milan, Fiat automobiles rolled across new highways, and television flickered in homes that once had only candles. Yet in the quiet of evenings, when families gathered, the stories of America returned like a familiar refrain. By the 1970s, those who had been young soldiers in North Africa were now gray-haired men. They began to speak more openly of their captivity, no longer burdened by shame or suspicion. What had once been whispered confessions became public testimony. In community halls, veterans recounted the days when they worked American fields larger than provinces, when they played bocce with guards, when they discovered that bread could be soft and white, and that even enemies could show kindness. Reunions emerged. Former prisoners who had settled in America met their comrades who had returned to Italy. In 1988, at Hereford, Texas, a remarkable gathering took place. Old men who had once marched through its gates in defeat now walked back with wives, children, and grandchildren. They touched the chapel they had built with their own hands, tracing the rough concrete that had been made to look like marble. For some, tears came freely. "We came here as enemies," one said, "but we left as friends." The Americans who had known them came too, guards now bent with age, local families who had invited them for Sunday dinners. The air was filled with embraces, laughter, and the strange intimacy that only shared history creates. Grandchildren of both sides played together on the grass, unaware that their grandfathers had once stood on opposite sides of a war. In Italy, the legacy was quieter, but no less enduring. Farmers used techniques learned in Kansas or California. Mechanics remembered tools from New Jersey workshops. Bakers reproduced recipes once tried in camp kitchens. Even the language bore traces. Words and expressions picked up in America filtered into regional dialects. And in America, too, the mark remained. Families recalled the Italian boys who had danced in parish halls, who had painted chapels and fountains, who had left behind songs and recipes. Some women had followed their loves across the ocean, marrying in ruined Italian villages before returning to the United States. Their children grew up with two homelands in their blood. Historians, looking back, would call it one of the most successful prisoner of war experiences in modern history. Not because conditions were luxurious, they were not, but because in those years of captivity, the walls between enemies thinned. The men discovered that prosperity came not from conquest, but from freedom, that democracy could feed and clothe even its prisoners better than dictatorship could its soldiers. For many, the memory of America was not paradise itself, but a glimpse of what paradise could mean: dignity, opportunity, kindness. It was a vision they carried home, a seed that took root in their families and communities, and threw them in the Italy that rose from war's ashes. The camps have long since vanished, their barracks turned back into farmland or swallowed by suburbs. But in Hereford, Texas, the chapel still stands, a modest shrine to a time when enemies became allies, and across two continents, families remember the legacy of those Italian prisoners endures not in stone or monuments, but in the friendships, the traditions, and the quiet conviction that even in war's darkest shadow, humanity can still find light.